Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of February, and today we're primarily focusing on the Battle of Avdiivka, and that's because over the past 3 days, the Russian forces have continued making important gains in the northern part of the city, including taking over a key logistical choke point, according to deep states, and that is in spite of the Ukrainians sending in additional reinforcements. So we're going to get into all of that. We're going to turn the clock back a couple of days to February 10th and look at the situation as it unfolded. So on February 10th, the front line looked something like this, and I made a video on that same day. In essence, the front line of contact looked something like this, where the Russian forces had their solidified positions east of the rail line in a lot of these residential blocks, and the trenches or whatever defenses were built in the gardens in between them. And the Ukrainians, they themselves tried to build a solid defense line that was past the rail line, but also to the east of Industrial Avenue, because the entire goal of the Ukrainians in this narrow strip of land was to protect this paved road, Industrial Avenue. And so the Ukrainian forces, they sent in additional companies, whatever forces in the region they could muster up to be sent into this narrow strip of land, which really only is several hundred meters just to the east of Industrial Avenue. In some of the houses in the region, there were some business enterprises, so the buildings over there were used by the Ukrainians to build the line of defense. There were also trenches that were dug in over the past couple of weeks that were utilized by the Ukrainians. And so this entire area was heavily built up by the Ukrainians, and they sent it in order to hold the line for as long as possible and prevent the total logistical breakdown of their forces in the city. And so, using the cover of relatively foggy weather conditions, the Russian forces launched additional attacks past the rail line on the 10th of February. And really, a big issue for the Ukrainians has been this foggy weather that has marred Avdiivka throughout late January and early February. And that's because when you have those foggy weather conditions, it's much more difficult for the Ukrainian drone operators to get reconnaissance that's accurate about Russian movement and to conduct FPV strikes or quadcopter drones dropping grenade strikes onto Russian positions. And that's been one of the ways that Ukraine's been trying to compensate for their massive disadvantage in artillery, which generally along the front line is 5-1, and in key sectors could actually be larger. And so, for instance, in Avdiivka, the Russian forces do have a massive advantage in firepower, and we've seen specifically in this narrow strip of land how the Russian forces are taking advantage of that. And so not only was there heavy artillery MLRS shelling of this narrow strip of land, but the Russian forces spent the past couple of days dropping some of their Fab 500 and Fab 1500 bombs onto this region. So you could say within this narrow strip of land, there were probably dozens of bombs that were dropped, and they have a very large explosive radius. And so even though a lot of the buildings where the troops were located are very strong that could withstand such an attack, just due to the concentration of forces, it did still lead to casualties. And so the Russians took advantage of their firepower advantage and the momentum they already had on February 10th to break past the rail line and gain a foothold around some of the residential blocks. So this was their initial foothold. So although this is a very narrow piece of land that we're referring to, we'll actually take out a measuring stick and try to measure it at its widest. At its widest, it's not even 1 kilometer in between the road and the rail line. Despite that fact, the Ukrainians did have an emphasis on defending the strip of land that is furthest to the north, right to the south of the coke plant. And so you had a lot of Ukrainian resources being set up in that region to prevent the Russian forces from directly reaching the point at which the road, the 0542 road, branches out to the south, going into Avdiivka, and to the north, going to the coke plant. But the Russian forces, they attacked several dozen meters, you could say, I suppose, to the south, and they actually launched their breakthrough around this region over here, as I talked about. And so that further spread the Ukrainians thin, because we're talking now at a company level, basically, with dozens, scores, and then reaching the hundreds of forces fighting in this particular region. And the Russian forces took advantage of their general momentum in this region to launch even further attacks, get control over the Dacha area over here, and expand control of their original salient that I have marked in red here from February 10th on February 11th. And they got control of additional residential blocks, getting actually a foothold into some of the businesses in the area. And so, just to mark the front line, looked something like this. So on February 12th, there were no confirmed gains. So that period of time was likely an opportunity for the Russian forces to solidify control of their gains that were made past the rail line. Because remember, this is an area that was being heavily defended by whatever forces the Ukrainians could send into that direction, whether they be from Lestochkine or from the southern part of Avdiivka. A lot of forces were moved in, thrown to this direction to prevent the breakdown of the logistical situation. And so the Russian unit that's been doing a lot of these attacks in northern Avdiivka is actually the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, which is a part of the DPR 1st Army Corps. And of course, they, on a wider basis, have been supported by the 2nd and 41st Combined Arms Armies of the Russian military. But now to go back on February 13th, which is today, Deep State reported, and again, this is coming from Deep State specifically, there's no geolocated footage of these advances, which is why I'm not 100% certain. I am pretty certain in the reporting though, because throughout the Battle of Avdiivka, I have been using a lot of Deep State's reporting, and generally it's been accurate. Additionally, Deep State, being a Ukrainian aligned source, having a massive Ukrainian audience, they don't have an interest in making the situation seem even worse than it already is for the Ukrainian side. And so I am inclined to believe what they say. Of course, there are errors, but they do have context on the ground. Their mapping on the 13th of February was adjusted to indicate that the Russian forces have expanded control further north along the rail line past the dachas, making their way to the southern outskirts of the coke plant around this section over here. Additionally, they claimed that the Russian forces were able to get control over this entire 800-meter strip of land from the rail line and actually reach Industrial Avenue and cut it open. And the Russians were able to get control over a section of the road which spans about 800 meters itself. So now the Russian forces have physically cut off this road, and by doing so, they've been able to take over the gas station marked over here. They were able to take over the businesses. They were able to take over garages, and a lot of these garages have been fortified and turned into military positions. And in between a lot of the houses and the gardens, there are trenches that were built up by the Ukrainians. All of those would also be overrun. And there was also the post office over here that was taken over by the Russian forces. And so this entire section that you're seeing over here was taken over in the course of 3 days in a very, very fierce battle that was assisted by the Russian FABs and artillery. So what is the significance of this advance? Well, if you see on my map, in yellow I have marked the main supply roads leading to Avdiivka, and those are paved roads. In green, those are dirt roads or other such unorganized paths. They're not paved. That's the main point. And so now the Ukrainians, they physically can't utilize this yellow road, Industrial Avenue, to make it into the center of Avdiivka. It could still, in theory, be used by the Ukrainians to send in additional forces, supplies, or to perhaps withdraw along the road from the coke plant. And so there is that connection, although the Russian forces are very close to cutting off the choke point between the rear and the coke plant as well. It's only a matter of a couple hundred meters. But if we look further south at Avdiivka itself, which is now severed from the coke plant, there is no longer any cohesion between the two Ukrainian nodes of defense. The coke plant is very important as there were a lot of Ukrainian troops stationed over there that have been acting as a unified body, firing onto Russian forces, using it as an observation post, and generally using it as a forward defensive position. The Russian forces have tried to evade, and so now there's no longer the direct connection with the rest of Avdiivka. And so now Avdiivka, that is on its own, there are only 3 paths that could feasibly be used by the Ukrainians. One of them, it branches out from a unpaved road, dirt road from Lestochkine, goes further south, and then makes its way into the northern entrance to the 9th district, which is the Citadel district of the city, where you do have a lot of high-rise apartment buildings. It's an area the Ukrainians are looking to fortify in a similar way to what they did in Bakhmut in the western section of that city. There's another route that, as you can see, starts in Severna and then makes its way directly to the same section of the 9th district. And then there's also this other road that branches out from Severna and then goes along a tree line that's very, very close to the line of contact and then makes it into the southern entrance of the 9th district. That one's probably not going to be used much by the Ukrainians. If anything, the Ukrainian forces that are stationed in the Zenit air defense system, in that base, they may try to use this road that's marked in blue by me over here. They may try to use that road to either go back into Avdiivka or to just withdraw from the entire salient in general. So to sum it up, the Ukrainians, who have an estimated 5,000 men in the Avdiivka area, although the number could be reduced, it could now increase a little bit based on the amount of reinforcements. There is a garrison of give or take a couple thousand. This garrison, whether they want to resupply, whether they want to get additional reinforcements to hold the line, to conduct localized counterattacks, to cover for them in withdrawals, or if they want to just move out a large force at the same time back to the rear to a place like Orlivka or Lasochkinya, now they have to do that through three unpaved roads or through open fields. And the open fields, they would be within a width of the line of contact of around 2.8 kilometers. So there is a 2.8 kilometer strip of land through which all of those forces would have to leave this bottleneck, where the Russian forces would be able to launch a myriad of different factors, a myriad of different types of firepower that they have at their disposal, including a lot of short range weapon systems at vehicles, at troop concentrations as they're making that journey. So it is extremely dangerous. And really, there is no easy way out of it, because if you look at the two options, one is to just hold the line at the current section where the Russian forces have their salient that has taken control over a section of Industrial Avenue to prevent the Russian forces from cutting off additional dirt roads. That's one option. The other option for the Ukrainians would be to try to conduct a localized counterattack. In any case, there would still be high casualties just based on the fact that the Russians holding onto their positions in the salient that we saw them gain over the past 3 days would give them a base, a forward operating base to fire onto Ukrainian forces as they make their way in and out of the city. If the Ukrainians try a localized counterattack, that is also going to lead to very high casualties, as the Russian forces do have the firepower on their side, they do have the dug in positions on their side, and the Ukrainians would be in an uphill battle. And in addition to the logistical situation being in dire straits, the Russian advances have also allowed them to get closer to key parts of Avdiivka within the center of the city. So you have a lot of the apartment buildings and the train station located in this section over here of Avdiivka, the heart of the city, where you do have a lot of Ukrainian troops that were recently pushed back from the northern part of the city, currently stationed. And so that's an area that's very close to the Russian positions. And then, as I said before, the Russian forces are closing in on the 9th district. And the Ukrainians, they do want to buy as much time as possible, because they do want to try to turn this area into a fortress. And that would be the means by which they could drag out the battle over here for as long as possible. And so now, from the southern flank, the Russians are only about 800, 900 meters away from that district. And then from the north, the Russians are only about 1.4 kilometers away from it. And while the Russians are conducting these advances in the northern part of the city, they have not stopped their attacks in the southern section. So now this residential quarter that we've been talking about a lot, the southwesternmost residential quarter of the city, the area where the Ukrainians have been trying to counterattack ever since the Russians broke through the Ukrainian fortifications in southern Avdiivka on the 19th or 18th of January. This area where the Ukrainians have been trying to counterattack, they have failed in doing so. They failed to establish positions in this region. They have failed to expel the Russians from this residential quarter. And so now the Russians have largely solidified control over it. This was backed up by footage released by the Russian side from the 9th of February, which shows their forces walking along the roads at the northwestern edge of the quarter, which gives them this salient. It gives them this foothold that's very close to the 9th district and very close to all of the valleys on which Ukrainian troops are stationed within the residential sections of the city itself. Now, the Russians do have this residential quarter and the heights that it's located on to use for their disposal. Further south, Deep State also reported on numerous Russian assaults targeting the Zenit air defense base, but they claim that all such attacks were repelled, and there's no evidence to the contrary. Recently, the Russians have been hitting the defense base very hard. Again, there's a lot of concentrated Ukrainian forces over there, so it is perfect for the type of firepower the Russians are using. A lot of artillery strikes on it. There were some FPV drone strikes on the Ukrainian positions over here. And the Russians were actually able to get control of some of the fields and tree lines to the west of the system. But they were unable to develop that success into fully cutting off or taking over the air defense base. But if you look further north, the Russian forces have tightened the noose around the facility. So the Russian forces originally had their line of contact look something like this. So the Russian forces advanced southwards, and they gained a foothold past this rail line over here and started taking over control of some of the dachas that the Ukrainians had fortified in the section over here that I'm marking in blue. This section is a small area where you have a few cottages that in between them, there's a lot of trenches, and so now the Russian forces have taken over the roads on which they run along, and they've taken over some of those fortifications, which means it's even more difficult for the Ukrainian garrison if they ever wanted to try to withdraw from this region. They really are at a bottleneck, and at the shortest distance, they are only 700 meters away from being surrounded by the Russian forces completely. So it is a very difficult situation for them, but they are trying to hold out for as long as possible in order to tie down Russian forces in this particular section, in order for them to not focus on other parts of southern Avdiivka. Now, with the general situation deteriorating for the Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka, and especially for the 110th Mechanized Brigade, there really has been a conversation that I've raised about the combat capabilities of the unit, because if you recall, they've been fighting over here for nearly 2 years in the Donetsk front, especially in the city of Avdiivka, and they have been at the forefront of Ukraine's defense both in the northern and the southern parts of the city ever since the Russians launched their offensive on October 10th. And so now it's being reported by the spokesperson of the brigade that at least elements of the units, so several battalions, are being withdrawn from the battles from Avdiivka, and they're being moved to the rear, which really is well deserved after they've been treated so much, and it's extremely necessary. And that is why now the Ukrainians are moving in the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov to send their forces to fight in Avdiivka. And so if you recall, the 3rd Assault Brigade, they are this Ukrainian unit that fought in the counteroffensive. They fought on the Bakhmut fronts. They took over Klishivka and Avdiivka. They were involved in those operations. And then following those heavy battles where they probably did suffer a lot of attrition, they had to be moved to the rear. So this happened around October, November. They were moved to the rear. And ever since, they've been training, they've been recuperating, getting additional recruits. So they do have about 2,000 men in their ranks. And now they have had their training cut short as they're being moved back to the front line to replace the elements of the 110th Mechanized Brigade. And so now we have footage from this unit, from Azov, this unit, with M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and with MRAP Max Pros. And so they have been given additional Western supplies. And now that they have those at their disposal, they have been moved in to the fighting at the forefront of Avdiivka, as was originally reported by Forbes and was then confirmed by a video that was posted actually today, which shows a certain unit, certain squad from the 3rd Assault Brigade in an MRAP being shelled by the Russian forces. And so it seems like they were immediately moved into the hottest part of the fighting in northern Avdiivka to try to hold back the Russian assault towards Industrial Avenue. But based on Deep State's reporting, the area on which the geolocation was found is now under Russian control, and so the 3rd Assault Brigade was likely pushed back. So now there's a question about whether they're going to have their forces set up in the coke plant, whether they're going to disperse them around, and some will be trying to hold the line or conduct localized counterattacks. That's something that we don't know yet. Only time will tell. But they are one of the only brigades that we could say with certainty that the Ukrainians had fully on the rear. And due to the desperation of the situation, that one unit had to be moved to replace the current garrison in Avdiivka to, at the very least, hold the line. And the Russian forces are well aware of this rotation that's ongoing by the Ukrainians. They know that the Ukrainians are moving in additional resources, both in terms of manpower and equipment, to the Avdiivka front, not just into the city, but also to the perimeter to prevent a wider collapse. And so, for instance, the Russian forces have been conducting some strikes, whether it be from LMLRS fire or from airstrikes deep into the Ukrainian rear. And when I say deep, I don't mean that deep, but it is in the dozens of kilometers away from the front line. And so there's just one example that I have marked on my map based on this geolocation, which shows Russian strikes on Sukurny. And this is one of these many towns that is in Donetsk Oblast, especially in the Pokrovsk Rayon, which is this region over here. This is a very important region for the Ukrainians because, as you can see, this is a road junction, it's a rail hub, and from there all the roads split up and go towards the front line in Donetsk. If they go southwards, they go towards Vuhledar, Marinka, that entire part of the front line. If they go eastwards, then they go towards Avdiivka. And so this is an area, basically a final staging point for the Ukrainian forces in bulk before they get spread out to various smaller portions of the front line. And so it seems like a lot of those Ukrainian resources in this particular case were being unloaded in Sukurny, which is about 18 kilometers away from the current fighting in Avdiivka. And so, what the Russians are claiming, which can't really be verified based on the footage, is that they destroyed 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 trucks with ammo and equipment, 2 minibuses, and 4 pickup trucks, in addition to a warehouse. And they claim the Ukrainian military suffered 30 losses in the attack. And this happened at the same time as there has been a lot of rumors. A lot of rumors have popped up regarding the situation in Selidove. This is a city, again, where a lot of roads pass through. There's this logistical point and rail line that runs just to the west of Selidove. And so this is an area where, again, it's highly likely that there are certain Ukrainian forces that are being unloaded before they get moved deeper to the front line, with some of them probably being from the 3rd Assault Brigade before they were sent into Avdiivka. And so what the Russians are claiming is that there was a rather large concentration of Ukrainian forces. The number that I've seen floating around, which really does seem like way too much to me, but we're gonna have to wait and see to get the full details on the matter. What they're claiming is that there were about 1,500 Ukrainian forces stationed in the city in their staging points, and that they were caught by the Russian reconnaissance and in 3 different rounds of strikes hit by Iskander missiles, which had the cluster munition warhead. And so the third time, it was actually a strike when the evacuation services came and all of the dead and wounded were being moved away to different hospitals in the Dnipro region. And so due to the commotion that was going on, due to the mass evacuations, that third round of strikes was particularly lethal, as you had such a large concentration of people trying to deal with the situation. And so I don't know if this is actually true. And even based on the current claims, there are a lot of conflicting information. And according to the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian MOD, they are denying that there was a mass casualty event. So we still don't know for sure, as the local media is not reporting about the situation much. And the Russian side is trying to explain this by saying that the Ukrainians are trying to create a media blackout in order to not lower morale and to hide the extent of the losses. None of this could be verified on either side, but what I do know for sure is that the Russian forces have significantly increased the amount of deeper strikes that have been occurring in the Donetsk region onto forces that are likely being moved towards Avdiivka. And that shows the Russian forces are preemptively trying to destroy the Ukrainian assets before they could be used in whatever capacity they want in their operations on the front line in Avdiivka. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.